Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to be talking about emotions and conflict, and specifically we are going to be working through these goals. We're going to begin by talking about the concepts of emotion coaching and emotion dismissing. These terms are not specifically mentioned in your readings, but I think they are really important ideas that I want you to be familiar with, and they do a good job to provide a framework for the rest of the content that is in your chapter. So we'll start with emotion coaching and emotion dismissing. Make sure you just pay really close attention to these terms since you won't get them in your reading. After that, we're going to talk about strategies for effectively using emotions in conflict. I'll identify a long list of strategies that are mentioned in your chapter, but I'm only going to go into a couple of them in detail. In this lecture, we're going to look specifically at the core concerns framework, and we're going to look at the feelings inventory. The other strategies I have identified in the lecture, you'll want to make sure that you go back and review more closely in your chapter. So let's get started. All right, so as I mentioned, I wanted to introduce you to the concepts of emotion coaching and emotion dismissing. These terms were coined by the psychologist John Gottman. Gottman is known as kind of a relationship guru in the field of psychology and communication. He studies marriage, he studies parent-child interaction, and he studies a wide variety of family dynamics, and has been researching interpersonal relationships for decades. His work is very widely cited in both kind of academic realms as well as popular press outlets. If you were to Google John Gottman, all kinds of information would come up, and you could certainly learn a lot more about his work. But again, two of his most famous concepts that have come from years and years of empirical research are the concepts of emotion coaching and emotion dismissing. He primarily applies these concepts to the concept of parenting and how parents attempt to help their children learn how to manage emotions. But they are super relevant concepts even for us as adults and for us who are engaging with our friends and roommates and siblings and so on. So to better understand the concepts, I've got a couple of columns here that we can take a closer look at. On the left-hand side, you can see that I mentioned the concept of emotion dismissing, and I give you some descriptions of what it means to be dismissive of emotions. If you are in this category, if you are emotion dismissing, odds are you held many of the common misconceptions that were mentioned in your chapter. Yeah, on page 195, your authors provide a long list of beliefs about emotions and conflict that people commonly hold, and then they go on to refute those beliefs. Emotion dismissers tend to hold on to these ideas. So people who are emotion dismissing tend to see negative emotions as toxins, as your book points out, right? They tend to see, they point out that emotions should be ignored, that one should ignore emotions to resolve a conflict well. Right? That we don't want to have to feel the emotions. Right? That's really very much into this emotion dismissing category. Part of that might be because emotion dismissing has to do with not, in some cases, not having a good language or a detailed way of talking about emotions. That creates anxiety, that creates worry, that again creates this concept, like this need for avoidance, just not want to have to deal with the emotions. All right, with that being said, then we look over at the other column here, emotion coaching. Emotion coaching views emotions as not something that are negative and that have to be avoided, but instead emotions provide opportunity for learning and understanding. Emotions are not something that we can work, above or below or around. According to this philosophy of emotion coaching, emotions are something we have to work through. And by doing so, we can actually understand ourselves better, and we can understand those around us better, even those that we're in conflict with better. And again, part of this has to do with being able to have a really good language to be able to think about and talk about emotions. Sometimes when I talk about the importance of language and understanding something, I like to give a little example. I like to talk about my husband and his love of cars versus my kind of lack of knowledge about cars. So my husband is like a total gearhead. He grew up rebuilding cars with his dad. He has a 1973 Barracuda that he and his dad put back together when he was a kid. If that means anything to any of you, but some of them you might recognize that concept or that car. So when we are going down the highway and we are passing cars, my husband has a very detailed language for all things cars. He can see something, he can hear something, and he can name it like that. And he can describe it at this level of sophistication that means, frankly, absolutely nothing to me. I barely even recognize the words that he's using as English, right? So he sees this car and he's like, oh my gosh, and he can name the make and the model and the specific engine that's in it. And I mean, it's hard for me even to identify some of the other things that he can describe because I don't have that language. On the other hand, I see the exact same car and I say, oh, well, that's a pretty red car. Or, oh, maybe that's a nice loud red car at best, right? So I use that example to point out the fact that when you have a detailed language for something, then you can observe it better. You can talk about it better. You can understand it better. You can share information about it with someone else better. Language helps us do all of those things. So the car example might seem kind of silly. Maybe you can think of some other kind of context that fits better, for you or your romantic partner or whatever. But if we take that car example, then we can apply it to emotions as well. Emotion dismissers tend to not have a very good language or a very sophisticated language to help them talk about emotion. Therefore, like we just said, it makes it harder for them to observe what emotions those around the people around them are feeling. It makes it harder for them to understand what emotions they're feeling. It makes it harder for them to describe and tell others about the emotions they're feeling, and so on and so on. On the other hand, people in this emotion coaching category, people with higher emotional intelligence, tend to have a better language to be able to describe emotions, which again helps them observe emotion better, talk about it better, understand it better, share it better, and so on. All right. With all of that being said, I do want to point out Gottman would never claim that you're either stuck as being in the emotion dismissing camp or you're an emotion coacher, right? He would never say that it just happens, that it's some innate thing that you either are or you aren't. He would argue that people can learn to, be in this right-hand column, that parents can help teach their children to have higher emotional intelligence through emotion coaching strategies. But he would also argue that a lot of the techniques that are mentioned in your chapter, and a few of the ones we're going to talk about today, can help us have a higher emotional intelligence, right? Have us be on this farther on this right-hand column, right? And then ultimately, if we bring that all back to conflict, can help us more effectively utilize emotions in a conflict. So let's move forward and take a look at some of these strategies. On this slide, I've listed 6 different strategies that are mentioned in your chapter as ways to help us make sure that using emotions have a more positive impact in our conflict. At the top, I have the core concerns framework and the feelings inventory. We're going to circle back to those, and I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. But in addition to that, I do want you to make sure that you're already familiar with, or you go back and you review the circumplex model of emotions. That is mentioned on page 198 of your textbook. There's a good visual that can help you kind of think about that, and also a good application scenario that it's worth taking a little bit of time to review. In addition to that, the traffic light mindfulness activity is mentioned in your textbook, and I think it's really useful. Honestly, I think it's a great tool that I hope you might even take with you after the semester is over and attempt to utilize in conflicts, particularly in situations where you might feel yourself feeling kind of emotionally flooded or overwhelmed by emotion. The traffic light mindfulness strategy is listed on page 216. In addition to these strategies, your textbook offers 2 really specific communication-related strategies that can help us kind of work through emotions in a conflict. As your textbook authors point out, when we feel emotionally flooded, when we feel our body kind of having that physiological response to emotion, it is really hard to kind of remember effective communication strategies, right? We have some of that evolutionary residue with fight and flight and some of those kind of things. But with that in mind, that makes it all the more important to really kind of think through some of these communication strategies to help, in hopes that they become kind of more habitual and more natural. So your book specifically mentions the XYZ formula for clarity. If you've had me in Family Comm, we talk about this a little bit there. I think it's such a powerful, relatively simple approach. So double check that. I'm trying to find out what page it's on for you. Yeah, go check page 221. And another really valuable communication strategy that your book mentions is called fractionation, right? Also, I think a super duper useful communication related strategy that I encourage you to look at. That's on page 223. Okay, the last bullet point there is not necessarily a really specific strategy, but I do want to call your attention to it. Don't skip out on the end of the chapter. At the very end of the chapter, I think the authors do a particularly good job of kind of summarizing the idea that when it comes to managing emotion and transforming emotion to more positive than negative, that ultimately it's our own personal responsibility. That our tendency might be to want to change how someone else feels, or to change the situation. But the one thing that we actually have control on is ourselves, right? We don't necessarily have control of another person or a situation. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, but just a reminder, finish at the end of the chapter there for some good info. All right, so anyway, these are all a bunch of strategies that I think could be super useful, but I just want to go into detail for the first two. First, here we have this core concerns framework. This is mentioned on, let's scroll back here, on page 199 of your chapter. And I think it's super valuable. Again, I think this could be one tool that you take with you after this semester that you actually might find very applicable in the real world. And it's only got 5 pieces to it, so I think it'll take a little bit of effort to commit it to memory, but if you do that, then you'll have this at your disposal in future situations when you're in conflict, and you, again, might feel like those emotions are getting the best of you. Ultimately, the core concerns framework says human beings are kind of hardwired to have a certain set of needs and desires. That regardless of who we are, male, female, old, young, race, ethnicity, whatever, as human beings, we have these kind of underlying needs. And it points out that when these needs are not getting met, we are bound to have a negative reaction, experience negative emotion. And so in the spirit of managing conflict, and in situations where we have a genuine desire to actually resolve the conflict, we are better served by trying to meet these needs of the other than trying to kind of step on them or trying to, maybe even just simply pretend they don't exist. Sometimes it can be really tempting to only focus in on our own needs and our own desire for these 5 things. But if we want to make sure that the conflict actually resolves, it's important that we not only acknowledge our own needs, but we acknowledge that the other person has these as well. Right? So again, if you're looking at page 199, you can see a really good detailed description of each of these needs. First and foremost, we all have the need for appreciation. Right? We all want to feel valued. That's not rocket science, and I don't think I need to belabor that point. I think we've all been there at some point, right? We all need to feel appreciated in some way, and we can think about what happens when we aren't feeling that. Right? If you have taken Family Comm with me, you might remember, even if you haven't, you might be familiar with the concept of the 5 love languages, right? In that particular book, Gary Chapman uses this metaphor of a gas tank. And in that argument, what he claims is we all have this metaphorical gas tank. And if the gas tank isn't full because we don't feel valued, if people aren't making us feel important and our gas tank is on E, then basically we're no good to anybody else. We have no motivation and no desire to act in a way that's kind or respectful to anyone else. Just like if your car gas tank is on empty, it's not going anywhere. It's not of no service to you. But when our gas tank feels full, when we feel valued and we feel appreciated, then we can act in ways that help others feel valued and appreciated, right? So, according to this core concerns framework, a really important piece of trying to manage conflict is to, and frankly, not just help another person get what they want, but help get us what we want, is to make sure that there is kind of this mutual feeling of feeling valued and feeling appreciated. Autonomy is the next core concern that's mentioned. And of course, we know that autonomy has to do with independence and feeling like we have some freedom in how we think and how we act and behave. right? We don't like it when we feel like someone is stepping on our autonomy, right? I think that's particularly an American Western value, right? We don't like feeling like we're being told what to do. It feels disrespectful. One of the phrases that your book uses that I think sums it up so nicely is the argument that coercion guarantees a lack of cooperation. Just think about that for a minute. Coercion guarantees a lack of cooperation. I can feel that in my bones. I don't know about you guys, but can you relate to that? Can you, either side of that? Maybe you are the one trying to get someone to do something and you're trying to use coercive or kind of dominating, threatening tactics, and you get pushback. I can relate to that. As a parent, I can really relate to that in that scenario. But I can relate to the other side as well. I can relate to that feeling of feeling pressured or coerced to doing something. And my immediate reaction is, even if maybe, I would have initially been willing to do it, now that you're coercing me, now that you're pressuring me to do it, I am not going to cooperate, right? And so, being aware of that and acknowledging that, and thinking through in situations where you're in conflict, thinking through ways where you can still kind of save the other person's face, when you can respect their own autonomy. It may seem a little counterintuitive at first, but recognizing that when you do that, you're probably actually a lot more likely to get cooperation than relying on the coercive tactics. Again, I'm going to circle back to that parenting strategy, right? I think about, especially when my kids were littler, but it's true now still, just maybe the situations are a little more complex. When I offer my kids choice, or at least the perceived choice, then they tend to be much more likely to pick and to go along than when I demand or tell them they have to do something, right? If you want to choose to eat, carrots or celery, okay, they'll pick one or the other, versus if I tell them you have to eat a vegetable at dinner. Okay, the third core concern that's mentioned in your book, I'm looking at page 200 here, refers to affiliation. Affiliation is the need to belong, right? We all want to feel like we are connected to others, right? And so anytime we can help someone feel that, then they are going to be much more likely to work with us and to cooperate with us, right? And to engage rather than push back. Number 4, status. Status has to do with comparing ourselves to others, right? Status has to do with a lot of those relational concerns that came up earlier in the semester when we were talking about trip goals, right? And how we feel about each other and our interaction with each other, right? No one wants to feel powerless or at the bottom of the totem pole, at least not all of the time. So acknowledging one's importance and acknowledging one's status, either in a work environment or even in a family or a romantic environment, is important. Finally, the last one here is role, right? And this has to do with the effectiveness of a particular job or position, right? And having to do with making sure that that person feels like they are in a kind of fulfilling and important role. So I'm not going to say that any of these things are necessarily easy to focus on and to follow through with in the middle of perhaps a particularly heated or emotionally charged conflict. But I do think it's really important to think about these now, right? Maybe when you're not in the middle of a conflict, and recognize their importance when you do find yourself in that situation, right? Being aware of these 5 concerns and how they might play out in future situations might really help to manage, the emotional positivity or negativity in that situation. All right. And in addition to that, I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of being able to label emotions. And as we know, and as we've talked about, not just in this chapter, but in other chapters throughout the semester, it can be really difficult to talk about highly charged things, about emotions. And so one way to help us do that is to make sure that we have a language that enables us to actually identify emotions and discuss them. Having a language that helps us distinguish between similar yet distinct emotions can be really valuable in not just observing what other people are feeling, but also better understanding what we're feeling ourselves. Right? And so my guess is when you were reviewing the chapter, you maybe just flew right past the emotions inventory. But I encourage you now to take a minute and go back and look at it a little bit more closely. I'm looking at figure 6.2 on page 202. And I just want to encourage you, take a little bit of time to kind of look at this long list of emotions. They have the emotions grouped between feelings where your needs are getting satisfied versus feelings you might have when your needs are not satisfied. So I think that distinction in and of itself is kind of valuable to think through. But then above and beyond that, I encourage you to look through these and kind of read through them and see, how many of those terms do you actually use, right? Or are there some words there that you don't tend to use? Is it because you're not feeling those emotions, or because you're not quite comfortable knowing if you could recognize those emotions or not? And maybe the next step also is look at some of these terms and think, could I distinguish between these terms? What really is the difference between feeling flustered and feeling mortified? And why might that matter? How I label that, or how, if I'm talking to someone, how they maybe label that term. So yeah, I just think it's worth it, not to blow right over this page, but to take some time here, and especially as communication scholars, to think about the meaning embedded in all of these terms and how comfortable and familiar you are with these different emotions and kind of some of the similarity and the differences between some of these emotions. Another thing you might do might really be worthwhile to just take some time and you have the list with you, but then flip through and find one of the scenarios that are mentioned in this chapter. There's obviously several throughout the whole chapter, but at the end here, right, on page 218, there's a nice long scenario regarding a financial conflict, which of course can be really emotional charged. And what you can do is you can go back and read about Victor and Tom and apply this emotion inventory to their experience and see how comfortable you feel, kind of trying to recognize the emotions that they're experiencing. And even better, you could do that with a classmate or maybe a friend or a roommate and see how much similarity and difference you might have in the way in which you actually apply those emotions. That could lead to some really interesting and I think valuable kind of conversation. All right, well, at this point, I'm almost at 25 minutes, so I'm going to wrap things up here. Hopefully, through the lecture, you have become more familiar with the concept of emotion coaching and emotion dismissing. You've been able to reflect on that a little bit. And additionally, hopefully you are now more aware of some strategies that can be used to help better understand and better work through emotion in a conflict, specifically the core concerns framework and the emotion inventory. I do just want to leave you with the thought that it's kind of a cop-out to say, you know what, I'm just not good at this. Right? And this is also kind of a theme through the semester. I'm just too emotional, or I'm not emotional enough. It's just who I am. Absolutely, we all have our own tendencies and our own habits. But if anything, hopefully by thinking about this chapter, you can recognize that there are ways, in fact, that we can become, more emotionally intelligent, that we can coach ourselves to be better at figuring out how to utilize our emotions in an effective way in a conflict. And take some personal responsibility there. All right, thanks guys. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.